He lost his leg fighting for his family, but at Christmas, his own dad called him a burden and kicked him out. Years later, this son made them regret it. Watch till the end. Don't forget to subscribe for more stories. Where are you watching from? Tyrone Walker had learned to watch the world through the cracked windows of the small, weather-beaten house on Lynen Street. The boards on the porch creaked when the wind pushed through, and the paint on the railing had long surrendered to the Georgia sun, peeling like tired skin. On the streets outside, kids ran barefoot, dribbling basketballs that had lost their bounce, while music from open windows mixed with the heavy scent of fried chicken and the humid, sticky air. Tyrone would watch them, the laughter, the reckless energy that children could afford, but he rarely joined. There were grocery bags to carry, chores waiting, and shifts that called for him before the sun even began its slow crawl over the rooftops of their block. Inside that small house lived the family that anchored Tyrone to that cracked porch and those dusty streets. His mother, Teresa, wore her weariness in the soft lines of her face, lines etched by years of late-night coughing fits and prescriptions she could only sometimes afford to fill. She moved with a slow grace, her smile genuine but fragile, like the trembling flame of a candle. She spent her days tending to his younger brother, Andre, who was obsessed with basketball, and his baby sister, Naomi, who would clutch her doll and look at Tyrone with wide brown eyes whenever he passed, expecting him to have the answers to everything. Their father, Charles, was a tall man with rough hands and a voice that could fill every room with its thunder. He drove trucks when work came, but the inconsistency of it often left him restless and bitter, and he found refuge at the bottom of cheap bottles. Sometimes he came home silent, dropping his cap on the floor, but other times he brought the storm with him, arguing with Teresa about bills, slamming doors, shouting words that carved themselves into the wood and the minds of his children. In those moments, Tyrone would sit in the corner, holding Naomi tightly, shielding her ears as if he could block out the rage vibrating through the thin walls. Tyrone learned early that responsibility was not something one chose. It was something one inherited without question. By the age of 12, he was carrying boxes at the corner store, sweeping floors in exchange for a few dollars that he would slip into his mother's trembling hands when Charles wasn't looking. Each dollar was another night with the lights still on, another bottle of cough medicine for Teresa's wheezing, another bag of rice on the stove. His mother would whisper her gratitude, pressing his face into her hands, eyes glistening, telling him he was her blessing. But outside, when Tyrone walked home under the dim streetlights, he would feel the weight of it pressing into his shoulders, the fear that if he stopped, even for a moment, everything would collapse around them. School was never easy for Tyrone, not because he struggled with the lessons, but because every minute in a desk was a minute he wasn't working. He was sharp, with a mind that could dissect the mechanics of a broken radio and piece it back together with screws he scavenged from abandoned appliances near the dumpsters. His teachers would marvel at his quick understanding, praising him for his essays and math tests, telling him he could be anything he wanted. Tyrone would nod, offering a polite smile, but inside he would hear the echo of Naomi's cough, the clink of coins in the jar that never seemed full enough, and the sharp voice of Charles reminding him that dreams were for people who didn't have bills to pay. Sometimes at night, when the arguing quieted down and the world fell into that heavy silence just before dawn, Tyrone would take out the old radio he was fixing and listen to the soft crackle of music, letting himself drift for a few moments. He imagined himself working in a small repair shop, his name on the door, the scent of solder and warm electronics filling the air, the gentle hum of the world working around him. He dreamed of Naomi sitting at a counter doing her homework, Andre practicing basketball in the alley without holes in his shoes, and his mother sitting in a chair by the window, breathing without pain. But dawn would come, and with it the reality that those dreams were distant, as fragile as the glass tubes inside the radios he fixed. His father would demand to know where the money was going, accusing him of holding back, calling him soft for caring too much about Teresa's medicine instead of helping pay for a new television, or the gambling debts that Charles never seemed to shake. Tyrone would stand there, gripping the edge of the counter, keeping his voice calm as he explained again and again that the money was gone to food, to rent, to medicine. Charles would curse under his breath, shaking his head as if Tyrone had failed some unspoken test of manhood. Andre, 4 years younger, watched Tyrone with quiet admiration, trailing after him whenever he could, dribbling a balding basketball along the cracked sidewalk, pretending that the dull thump was the roar of a stadium cheering for him. Naomi would follow too, her small hands clutching at Tyrone's pant leg as she looked up at him with trust so complete it terrified him. They depended on him, and that dependence was a weight that made every step heavier, every sunrise a reminder that he couldn't afford to fail. At 17, while other boys talked about college and girls, Tyrone was balancing school with 2 jobs, one at the grocery store and another at a garage where he learned to fix engines, using the knowledge he pieced together from library books and watching the mechanics, who didn't mind showing him tricks when the shop was slow. The owner, Mr. Harris, would pat his shoulder and tell him he had hands meant for building things, that he could have a future. Tyrone would smile, nodding, but inside he felt the urgency, the constant fear that if he let himself believe in a future, it would slip away, just like everything else that ever felt safe. One winter night, after a long shift, he came home to find Naomi crying because Teresa's medicine had run out, and Charles was nowhere to be found, the rent unpaid again. Naomi's cries cut through him sharper than any blade, and as he sat in the dark living room listening to the rattle in his mother's chest, he realized he couldn't keep patching holes in a sinking boat. He had to do something more, something that would truly lift them from the endless cycle of just surviving. He knew boys from the neighborhood who had gone into the army, coming back in uniforms with medals, steady pay, and stories of places far from Lynen Street. He had heard them talk about the pay, the benefits, the pride of wearing the uniform. It was a chance to provide, to be more than just another boy lost to the streets, to escape the cycle and give his family what they needed. It was a chance to finally breathe without the constant fear of tomorrow. Tyrone stayed awake that night, sitting by the window, watching the streetlights flicker. He heard the distant sirens, the occasional bark of a dog, the whispers of wind against the window pane. He looked at his mother, who had finally fallen asleep on the couch, her breathing shallow but steady, and at Naomi, curled up with her doll on the floor, her thumb in her mouth, trusting that the world would be safe because Tyrone was there. In that quiet, suffocating stillness, Tyrone made a promise to himself. He would join the army. He would send money home, pay off the debts, get Teresa the medicine she needed, buy Andre and Naomi new clothes, maybe even put aside enough to one day open that repair shop he saw in his dreams. He would become the man his family needed, no matter what it cost him, because it was his responsibility, his duty, and the only way he saw to break free from the shadows of Lynen Street. Before the dawn broke, Tyrone stood up, took a deep breath, and felt a strange calm settle over him. It was the calm of decision, of knowing that a path was set. He looked at the sleeping faces of his family, memorizing every detail, every soft breath, every line on his mother's face. He told himself he would come back stronger, that he would fix everything, that he would save them, because that was what he was born to do, and he would not fail them, no matter the price. The morning light seeped through the thin curtains, washing the room in a pale glow. Tyrone quietly gathered his things, put on his jacket, and stepped outside, the cold air biting at his skin as he walked towards the recruiting office. Each step away from the house was heavy, but it was also filled with a determination that burned hotter than the fear that clawed at the edges of his resolve. Linden Street faded behind him, but its weight remained in his chest, a constant reminder of why he could not afford to turn back. He was going to save them, and nothing else mattered. Tyrone's feet pressed against the cold linoleum of the recruitment office as he signed his name with a shaken hand, the ink soaking into the page like a promise he could never take back. He felt the weight of Linden Street in the pen, and the lines that defined the signature of a boy who was leaving everything behind to become something more. When he stepped out into the sunlight that morning, a backpack slung over one shoulder and his mother's whispered blessing still in his ear, he thought for a brief moment that the world felt lighter. The fear was still there, humming beneath the surface of his skin, but above it pulsed a sense of duty that made each breath feel like a step towards salvation for his family. The bus ride to basic training was a blur of dusty roads, and the smell of sweat, metal, and fear as young men like him shifted in their seats, trying to hide their nerves behind bravado. Some talked about girls and cars, others about the neighborhoods they left behind. But Tyrone kept his eyes on the road, seeing only Naomi's eyes, Andre's basketball bouncing on cracked concrete, and the way his mother's shoulders shook with each breath. His hands curled into fists when he thought about the unpaid rent, the medicine bottles on the counter, the tearful look in his mother's eyes when she promised she would wait for him to come home. At the training grounds, the first morning came with the shriek of whistles slicing through the cold dawn, boots pounding the dirt in unison as shouts from drill sergeants cut through the fog of sleep and fear. Tyrone felt the burn in his legs as he ran, the ache in his arms as he pushed himself off the ground again and again, the dirt and sweat sticking to his skin until he felt like he was being carved into something new. He learned to fold his uniform with precision, to lace his boots so tight they left impressions on his ankles, to respond to orders without hesitation, swallowing exhaustion and pain, because weakness was not allowed, not for the boy who had come here to save his family. There were nights when the barracks were quiet, save for the soft snores of exhausted bodies sprawled on bunks, when Tyrone would pull out a small notepad and scribble numbers, calculating how much he could send home each month, what it could cover, how quickly he could clear the debts that clung to Linden Street like a second skin. He pictured his mother at the pharmacy, paying for her medicine without counting coins twice, Andre with a new pair of shoes that didn't split at the seams, Naomi with a winter coat that kept the cold out, and, for a moment, the ache in his muscles felt worth it. He found companionship in faces that mirrored his own exhaustion and hope. Josh, from Texas, with a crooked grin and stories of rodeos and dusty roads, Malik from New York, whose sharp wit covered the sadness in his eyes whenever he talked about the brother he left behind. They became his brothers in arms, sharing rations and laughter in the brief moments they had, lending each other strength when the weight of the training made even the strongest buckle. Tyrone told them about Linden Street in pieces, about his mother's cooking when she was well enough to stand, about Andre's dreams of making it out through basketball, about Naomi's laughter like wind chimes on the porch. They listened, nodding, because they all carried stories stitched with pain and the desperate need to rise above where they came from. When the first paycheck arrived, Tyrone held the envelope in his hand for a long moment, feeling the thin paper vibrate with the possibility it carried. That night, under the dull glow of the barracks light, he wrote a letter home, enclosing most of the money, keeping only what he needed for soap, a phone card, and the occasional soda from the vending machine. He told his mother to use it for the bills, for food, for anything she needed. He told her he was fine, that the training was hard but good, that he was learning and getting stronger every day. He told her he would make them proud, even though his hand trembled as he wrote the words. Her reply came weeks later, the envelope thin, her handwriting shaky but warm. She thanked him, said the landlord had stopped knocking on the door, that she had bought medicine without borrowing from the neighbor, that Naomi was warm and Andre was studying hard. She told him she loved him, that she was proud of him, and Tyrone held that letter to his chest, letting himself believe, just for a moment, that everything was getting better. But with each letter came the reminders of Lynen Street's pull. The electric bill went up again, one letter would say. The landlord raised the rent, another would confess. Andre needs money for a school trip. Naomi's shoes are too small, the fridge is broken. Each letter carried a new plea, a new weight that settled in Tyrone's chest, making every step during morning runs feel heavier, every push-up harder as he tried to remember why he was there. And he would remind himself over and over that he was the man of the house, that he was the only one who could save them. The training hardened him, built his body into something capable, his mind into something sharper, but inside, the fear of not doing enough never left. During shooting drills, when the world narrowed to the target in front of him, he would see bills stacked on a table, eviction notices slipping under a door, his mother coughing into her hands as Naomi's eyes watched with quiet fear. He shot to protect them, to earn for them, to keep them from falling further into the shadows of poverty and fear. When his deployment orders came, Tyrone felt a cold wave wash over him. The desert was a word spoken with reverence and dread. Among the soldiers, a place where the sun scorched the earth and danger hid behind every corner. But with the orders came the promise of hazard pay, of sending more money home, of clearing the debts faster. That night, as he sat on his bunk, Josh and Malik on either side of him, the three of them quietly contemplating the future, Tyrone felt the mix of fear and determination settle into his bones. He was going to the desert, to the heat and the dust, to the place where boys became men, where lives were risked and taken, but he was going for his family, for Lynen Street, for the promise he made to himself that he would save them. He wrote home the night before deployment, telling his mother not to worry, that he would be careful, that he would come back stronger. He told Andre to focus on school, to keep playing basketball, to look out for Naomi. He told Naomi to be brave, to help their mother, and that he would bring her something special from overseas. He sealed the letter with shaking hands, breathing deeply, telling himself he was ready. The morning they left, the sun was still hiding behind the horizon, the sky a deep navy blue as they loaded into the transport trucks. Tyrone felt the rough fabric of his uniform against his skin, the weight of the gear pulling on his shoulders, the helmet pressing down on his head. Around him, men and women climbed into the trucks with the same quiet fear, the same silent prayers whispered into the darkness. As the engines roared to life, Tyrone looked out the small window, seeing the lights of the base flicker and fade as they pulled away. He saw in those lights the glow of Lynen Street, the porch light that his mother left on, the faint flicker of hope that maybe, just maybe, this would be the moment that changed everything. He clenched his hands, closed his eyes, and whispered to himself that he would come back, that he would return with stories, with money, with strength, that he would fix everything that was broken. In the quiet of that early morning, as the trucks rumbled forward, Tyrone Walker left behind the last pieces of the boy from Lynen Street, stepping into the role he had chosen, the role of the protector, the provider, the savior of a family that needed him more than they would ever say. And as the sun finally rose, casting light over the horizon, he let that light settle in his heart, believing that it would guide him back home, no matter how far he had to go. The heat of the desert was nothing like the humid warmth of Atlanta. It was a dry, biting heat that clung to the skin and drained every drop of moisture from the body, leaving lips cracked and throats parched even when the sun began to sink behind the dunes. Tyrone felt the sand inside his boots, rubbing against his skin as he moved with the others, the weight of the gear pressing on his shoulders while the sun turned the metal of his rifle into something that could burn if he wasn't careful. The air smelled of dust, oil, and sweat, the constant humming of engines a reminder that the world around them was never silent, even in the dead of night. They moved in convoys through roads littered with the remnants of past conflicts, rusted shells of vehicles standing like silent warnings. Each mission was marked by the tension that settled in the gut, a quiet that came before every checkpoint, every pause, every moment when they had to step out into the open and scan the horizon for something they could not see but always felt. Tyrone had learned to read the movements of the others, the way a hand rested a little too tightly on a rifle, the quick glances exchanged before stepping off the truck, the silent prayers murmured under breath while boots hit the ground. He found routine in the chaos, waking up to the calls of his sergeant, eating meals that tasted of salt and metal, drinking water that never seemed cold enough, and moving through the motions with a discipline that had become part of him. At night, he would write quick notes to his family, telling them he was well, that the son was strong, that he was making them proud. He never wrote about the fear, about the shadows that stretched across the sand, about the sounds of gunfire that shattered the quiet of the evenings. He didn't write about the nightmares that came when he managed to find sleep, the dreams of Naomi's laughter replaced by the sound of explosions, the faces of the children from home blending with the faces of those they passed in the streets, eyes wide and wary. Josh would sit next to him some nights, sharing stories about Texas, about the horses he used to ride, the open fields, and the sunsets that seemed to last forever. Malik would talk about the city lights of New York, the way the streets buzzed with life, the food carts and music that made even the cold nights feel alive. They would laugh sometimes, finding moments of light in the darkness, and in those moments, Tyrone felt like he was part of something larger, a brotherhood that understood the weight each of them carried, the sacrifices they had left behind. The day of the mission, the sky was an endless blue, the kind that seemed almost cruel in its beauty. They were tasked with escorting a supply convoy through a stretch of road that was known for being dangerous, a narrow path that cut through the desert like a scar. The air was thick with heat, and the wind carried the sand in waves that stung the skin, the visibility shifting with each gust. Tyrone checked his gear, adjusting the straps, feeling the familiar weight settle into place as he climbed into the lead Humvee. Josh was next to him, his helmet slightly tilted, the grin on his face doing little to hide the tension in his eyes. They started the journey with the rumble of engines, the convoy moving slowly, the radios crackling with updates, the chatter of voices clipped and precise. Tyrone kept his eyes on the horizon, scanning for anything out of place, his mind moving through the motions he had practiced, the training that had become instinct. He thought about home, about the last letter he had received from his mother, telling him that the landlord had finally stopped coming to the door, that Naomi had started school with new shoes, that Andre was practicing every day, dreaming of making the team. He let those thoughts steady him, grounding him in the purpose that had brought him here. As they moved, the road seemed too quiet, the kind of quiet that made the hairs on the back of his neck stand up. Josh was telling a story, something about a girl he had met during leave, his words easy, trying to fill the silence that pressed in around them. Tyrone nodded, forcing a small smile, but his eyes never left the road, the ditches that lined it, the abandoned vehicles that sat in the distance like skeletons bleached by the sun. Each mile felt heavier, the tension in the vehicle growing as they approached the point marked on the map as the most dangerous stretch. And then it happened. A sound that was not a sound but a force, a wave that tore through the air, lifting the Humvee off the ground as if it weighed nothing. Tyrone felt the world tilt, the heat replaced by a searing pain that shot through his body as metal twisted and glass shattered. For a moment, there was only the ringing in his ears, a high-pitched scream that drowned out everything else, the world moving in slow, jerky frames as the vehicle flipped and crashed back to the ground. Smoke filled the air, the smell of burning fuel mixing with the scent of blood and dust. Tyrone tried to move, the pain in his leg blinding, a scream caught in his throat as he looked down and saw the twisted shape of his lower limb, blood soaking into the sand beneath him. He saw Josh, his face pale, eyes wide and empty, his body unmoving, trapped under a piece of the vehicle that had crushed him. Tyrone reached for him, his hand shaking, calling his name, but there was no response, only the crackle of the fire and the distant sound of gunfire as chaos erupted around them. He crawled, pulling himself away from the wreckage, dragging his injured leg, each movement sending waves of pain that threatened to pull him into the darkness. His fingers clawed at the sand, the heat burning into his skin as he tried to reach for the radio, to call for help, to do something, anything, to stop the world from spinning out of control. The sounds around him were a blur, voices shouting, the pop of gunfire, the roar of engines, the thud of boots hitting the ground. As the darkness at the edges of his vision grew, he heard the distant sound of rotors, the thumping that grew louder, closer until it was overhead. Figures moved around him, hands grabbing him, lifting him, voices telling him to hold on, to stay with them. He tried to speak, to tell them about Josh, about the others, but the words wouldn't come, trapped behind the pain that consumed him. The last thing he saw was the sky, that endless blue now streaked with smoke, and he let the darkness take him, the hum of the helicopter, the last sound before everything went quiet. When he woke, it was to the blinding white of the hospital lights, the scent of antiseptic sharp in his nose, the beeping of machines, the rhythm that filled the silence. A doctor stood over him, his face calm, his words careful, explaining what had happened, what they had to do, that they couldn't save his leg, that they had removed it below the knee to save his life. The words were distant, echoing, as if they were meant for someone else, not for Tyrone, not for the boy from Lynen Street who had promised to come back whole, to fix everything. The days that followed blurred together, pain and medication mixing into a haze that left him floating, disconnected from the world around him. He saw other soldiers, some with bandages, others missing limbs, the air heavy with the unspoken pain of those who had survived but left parts of themselves behind. Nurses moved around him, checking charts, adjusting machines, offering smiles that never reached their tired eyes. At night, the darkness brought the memories back, the explosion, the fire, Josh's face, the sound of his own screams. He would wake in a sweat, the phantom pain of a leg that was no longer there burning through him. The sheets twisted around him as he gasped for air. They called it PTSD, the doctors explaining it with clinical terms, offering medication, therapy, words that felt hollow in the face of the images that haunted him. Tyrone refused, telling himself he was strong enough, that he could push through it, that he had to, for his family, for the promises he had made. He learned to walk again, each step on the prosthetic a reminder of what he had lost, the metal and plastic replacing flesh and bone, a constant, cold presence that he could never forget. Letters from home continued to come, his mother telling him she was proud, that they were waiting for him, that everything would be better once he came back. She didn't know the truth, the weight of the loss, the darkness that followed him even in the light. Tyrone wrote back, telling her he was healing, that he was strong, that he would come home soon, the words a shield against the reality that gnawed at him each day. When the day came for his discharge, Tyrone packed his few belongings, the uniform he had worn, now neatly folded, the medals placed carefully in his bag, each one a reminder of the cost they had come with. He looked in the mirror, seeing the reflection of a man who was no longer the boy who had left Lynen Street, the lines on his face deeper, the eyes carrying the weight of the desert, the weight of promises kept and broken. As he boarded the transport home, the world outside the window moved past in a blur, the cities and fields a patchwork of colors that felt unreal. Tyrone closed his eyes, breathing deeply, telling himself that he was going home, that he would continue to protect them, that he would find a way to rebuild, even with the pieces of himself that were missing. He was going home, and nothing would stop him from keeping the promise he had made to the family waiting on Lynen Street. The wheels of the bus hissed against the cracked asphalt as it pulled away from the station, leaving Tyrone standing there with his duffel bag slung over one shoulder, the cold metal of his prosthetic leg pressing against the inside of his pants. The air in Atlanta felt different than the hot winds of the desert, thicker, heavy with moisture and the scent of car exhaust and fried food from street vendors. People moved around him with hurried steps, laughter, and complaints, living lives that seemed distant from the world he had just left. For a moment, he closed his eyes and let the humid breeze wash over him, but it did not erase the phantom pain that pulsed where his leg had once been or the images that flickered in the back of his mind, moments of fire and sand and the hollow look in Josh's eyes that he could not forget. Andre was the one waiting for him, taller now, his teenage frame filling out, his eyes wide when he saw Tyrone stepping forward with the aid of his prosthetic, a forced smile on his face. Andre tried to hide the shock, moving quickly to help with the bag, talking fast about school, about a game he had played, about anything to keep from acknowledging the reality standing before him. Tyrone let him talk, nodding, listening, grateful for the distraction, grateful for the small, warm embrace when Andre finally hugged him, whispering that he was glad he was home. The walk to Lynen Street was filled with the sounds of the city, the hum of traffic, the distant music from passing cars, the occasional shout from children playing on the sidewalks. The houses looked the same, the cracked steps, the peeling paint, the worn-out porches where old men sat watching the world pass by. It was all so familiar, Yet Tyrone felt like a stranger moving through it, each step measured, careful as he adjusted to the uneven ground, the weight of the bag pulling at his shoulder, the phantom sensation in his missing leg a constant reminder that he was not the same man who had left. When they reached the house, the porch light was on, the screen door creaking as it opened, and his mother stood there, smaller than he remembered, her shoulders hunched, her eyes tired but filled with tears as she reached for him. The embrace was soft, her arms trembling around him, her face pressed against his chest as she wept quietly, repeating his name like a prayer. Tyrone held her, feeling the frailty in her frame, the sharp bones beneath her skin, the weight of all the years that had passed while he was gone. Naomi peeked from behind her, her hair in tight braids, her eyes wide as she clutched her doll, too shy to come forward at first until Tyrone smiled and opened his arm, letting her press herself against him, her small hands gripping his jacket as if to make sure he was real. His father was there too, standing back with arms crossed, eyes narrowed, assessing, weighing, the lines on his face deeper, the gray in his hair more pronounced. He gave a nod, a stiff pat on Tyrone's shoulder, calling him a hero, telling him he was proud, but the words felt hollow, floating in the space between them. They all moved inside, the familiar creak of the floorboards under his steps, the smell of home, of fried chicken and spices, of old wood and faint cleaning products. His mother had prepared a meal, simple but warm, and they all sat together, Naomi talking about school, Andre sharing stories about his basketball games, the conversation flowing around Tyrone as he listened, trying to let the normalcy settle into him, trying to let it heal the fractures that had deepened during his time away. For a while, it worked. The first few weeks were filled with small routines, waking up to the sound of birds outside, helping his mother in the kitchen, sitting with Naomi as she did her homework, watching Andre practice dribbling the basketball in the cracked driveway. Tyrone tried to help around the house, fixing loose cabinet doors, replacing light bulbs, cleaning up the yard. But every task reminded him of the limitations that came with the prosthetic, the strain on his balance, the way the stump ached by the end of the day, a deep, throbbing pain that made him grit his teeth and hide his discomfort from the family. At night, sleep did not come easily. He would lie in the small room they had prepared for him on the ground floor, the mattress too soft, the sounds of the neighborhood filtering through the thin walls, every loud noise making him flinch, every shout outside pulling him back to the heat and chaos of the desert. The dreams came, vivid and sharp, the explosion replaying in his mind, the weight of the sand, the cries of his fellow soldiers, the burning smell of fuel and blood, the vision of Josh's lifeless eyes staring up at the sky. He would wake in a cold sweat, the phantom pain in his leg flaring, his breath ragged as he tried to convince himself he was home, that he was safe, that it was over. During the days, the family's gratitude began to fade into routine, and routine began to shift into expectation. His father started asking about the pension, about the benefits, about what Tyrone could do now that he was home. At first, it was casual, a mention over breakfast, a question while they watched the evening news. But soon it became more direct, pressing, wrapped in the thin veil of concern that did not hide the greed behind the eyes that demanded answers. Tyrone explained that he was receiving a modest pension, that it was enough to help, that he was looking into finding work once he adjusted, once he healed enough to manage the prosthetic. But the disappointment was evident in his father's tight-lipped nod, the way his eyes drifted to the television as if the conversation was over. His mother would step in, telling him not to worry, that they were just glad he was home, but he saw the way she counted the grocery money, the way she hesitated before buying her medication, the way she glanced at the bills piling up on the kitchen counter. Naomi and Andre still looked at him with love, with the trust that had always been there, but even they began to sense the tension that was growing in the small house, the undercurrent of unspoken words that filled the air. Tyrone tried to find work, applying for security positions, for maintenance jobs, for anything that would allow him to contribute, to feel useful, to ease the burden that seemed to settle on his shoulders more heavily each day. But the panic attacks came when he least expected them, triggered by the sound of a car backfiring, the sharp clap of thunder, the slam of a door. His heart would race, sweat would break out on his skin, his vision would narrow, and he would find himself gasping for air. His mind transported back to the chaos, to the moment everything had changed. The employers would nod sympathetically, tell him they would call, but the calls never came, and Tyrone would return home, his hands trembling, the disappointment in himself gnawing at the edges of his resolve. His father grew more vocal, questioning his worth, reminding him of the money the family needed, asking what good a hero was if he couldn't even keep the lights on. Tyrone would bite back his words, swallowing the anger that rose in his throat, reminding himself that he had promised to take care of them, that he owed them for everything they had endured while he was away. He would transfer most of his pension to his mother's account, keeping just enough for bus fare and the occasional coffee when he went to job interviews, telling himself it was temporary, that he would find a way to make things right. The final fracture came during Christmas. The small house was decorated with old string lights that flickered, the scent of roasted chicken and sweet potatoes filling the air. Naomi's laughter as she played with a small plastic doll Tyrone had managed to buy her, Andre showing off his new basketball with pride. Tyrone had saved enough from what little he kept to buy small gifts, a scarf for his mother, a cheap watch for his father, something to show his gratitude, to show that he was still trying, still there for them. They sat around the table, the plates filled, the tree in the corner glowing with mismatched lights, the warmth of the moment almost enough to drown out the heaviness that had settled in Tyrone's chest. But, as the dinner progressed, his father, emboldened by the drinks he had been sipping throughout the day, began to speak, his voice loud, cutting through the laughter, drawing the attention of everyone at the table. He spoke of responsibility, of the weight of being the man of the house, of how things had fallen apart while Tyrone was gone, of how hard it had been for him to hold everything together. His words shifted from the past to the present, accusing, demanding, questioning what Tyrone was doing now, what he was contributing, why he was still sitting at that table, eating food paid for by others when he could not even hold a job, when he could not even stand without the aid of a piece of metal. The words pierced the warmth of the room, Naomi's eyes filling with tears, Andre looking down at his plate, the air growing thick with the silence that followed each accusation. Tyrone tried to respond, to explain, but the words caught in his throat, the shame and anger twisting inside him as his father's voice rose, calling him a burden, a disappointment, a cripple who was draining the family of what little they had left. Then came the words that shattered the fragile peace, the command, loud and clear, echoing in the small room as his father told him to get out, to leave, to stop being a weight around their necks. For a moment, everything froze, the lights flickering, the only sound Naomi's quiet sobs as she clutched her doll, Andre's fists clenched so tight his knuckles turned white. Tyrone stood slowly, the chair scraping against the floor, the pain in his leg flaring as he found his balance, his eyes meeting his father's, seeing the anger, the bitterness, the disappointment. He looked around the table, at his mother's tear-streaked face, at Naomi's trembling shoulders, at Andre's bowed head, and felt the weight of everything he had carried, everything he had sacrificed, everything he had promised, press into him until he thought he might break. Without a word, he turned, walking slowly to his room, each step deliberate, the prosthetic hitting the floor with a soft, rhythmic sound that seemed to echo louder than the words that had just been spoken. He packed his few belongings, the folded uniform, the medals he could no longer bear to look at, the small notebook where he had once written plans for the future. He placed them carefully into his worn duffel bag, taking one last look around the small room that had once been a refuge. When he stepped out into the cold night, the air sharp against his skin, the lights of Lynen Street stretching before him, Tyrone Walker felt the final tie to the home he had fought so hard to protect break quietly inside him, leaving a hollow space where hope had once lived. The door closed behind him with a soft click, and he walked into the darkness, each step heavy but certain, the path uncertain but his alone for the first time. The cold wrapped around Tyrone the moment he stepped off the porch, biting through the thin fabric of his jacket as he adjusted the strap of his duffel bag, the weight of it heavy but strangely comforting against his shoulder. The neighborhood was silent, the kind of silence that comes only in the deep hours of the night when even the dogs are asleep, and the hum of distant traffic sounds like a whisper. The glow from the street lights spilled across the cracked sidewalks of Lynen Street, catching in the frost that clung to the ground, turning the world into a quiet, shimmering place that felt both beautiful and unforgiving. Each step he took echoed softly, the steady click of the prosthetic a reminder of the battles he had fought, of the sacrifices made in the name of a family that no longer wanted him under their roof. He didn't look back at the house, though he could feel the weight of it behind him, the walls that had held so many dreams and so much pain, the rooms filled with memories of childhood laughter, of quiet mornings and chaotic evenings, of whispered promises that everything would be okay if they just held on a little longer. Those promises had shattered earlier that night, the shards of them still sharp in his chest as he moved down the street, the cold air stinging his eyes, though he refused to let the tears fall. The bus stop was empty when he arrived, the bench cold under him as he sat, shifting to ease the pressure on his leg. The phantom pain pulsed in waves, a dull ache that settled deep in the bone that was no longer there, a reminder that some losses could never be fully escaped. He pulled the straps of the bag tighter around his shoulders, glancing at the street, at the dark windows of the houses where a family slept, safe and warm, unaware of the man sitting alone in the cold, trying to find a path forward in a world that had become unrecognizable. When the bus finally arrived, its headlights cutting through the darkness, Tyrone stood, steadying himself before stepping on, the driver giving him a nod, a glance that held curiosity but no questions. He found a seat near the back, pressing his forehead against the cold glass of the window, watching as Lynen Street disappeared behind him, the lights fading until there was only darkness and the reflection of a man who no longer knew where he was, meant to belong. The bus took him to the edge of the city, to a neighborhood filled with the glow of neon signs and the smell of fried food that lingered even in the cold air. It was here that he found the small car he had managed to buy during his time in the army, an old sedan with peeling paint but an engine that still worked. He unlocked the door, the creak of the hinges loud in the quiet, sliding into the driver's seat, closing the door and sitting there for a moment, his hands on the steering wheel, the silence pressing in around him. The darkness outside felt safer than the light, the shadows a comfort as he closed his eyes, leaning back, the exhaustion of the day, of the years, settling over him like a heavy blanket. He let himself remember for a moment, letting the memories wash over him. The laughter of Naomi as she ran through the yard, Andre's excitement when he scored a point during a neighborhood game, his mother's tired smile as she sipped her tea, the way she would brush his hair back from his forehead when he was a child, whispering that he would grow up to be strong, that he would take care of them all. The tears came then, silent and unstoppable, carving hot paths down his cold cheeks as he pressed a hand against his eyes, the sob that escaped him sounding too loud in the small space of the car. He let himself break in that moment, let himself feel the weight of everything he had carried, the promises made and broken, the dreams sacrificed on the altar of duty and love for a family that could not, or would not, see him for who he was and what he had given. When the tears stopped, he took a deep breath, the cold air sharp in his lungs, and he opened his eyes, looking at his reflection in the rearview mirror. The man who looked back was not the same boy who had left Linden Street with dreams of saving everyone, with the belief that love and sacrifice would be enough to hold a family together. This man had seen the world break and had broken with it, had lost a part of himself on a dusty road in a country far from home, had returned to find that the battles at home were sometimes harder than those fought with weapons and armor. But in the hollow space that remained, there was something else, a flicker of something that felt like resolve, like the first breath after being underwater for too long. He wiped his face with the sleeve of his jacket, straightening in the seat, his hand tightening on the steering wheel as he turned the key in the ignition, the engine sputter into life, a low rumble that felt like a heartbeat in the quiet night. He drove through the city, the streets empty, the lights of the traffic signals changing for no one, the glow of storefronts casting long shadows across the pavement. He didn't know exactly where he was going, but he let the road take him, each mile a step away from the past, each turn a choice to keep moving, to keep fighting, even when the world felt like it had nothing left to offer. When the dawn began to break, painting the sky in pale shades of blue and pink, Tyrone found himself parked outside a small diner on the edge of the city, the neon sign buzzing quietly, the scent of coffee and warm bread slipping through the cracks in the windows. He stepped inside, the bell above the door jingling, the warmth of the place wrapping around him as he found a seat near the window, the prosthetic making a soft thud against the floor as he sat. The waitress, an older woman with kind eyes and a tired smile, brought him coffee without asking, and he wrapped his hands around the cup, letting the heat seep into his fingers, grounding him in the present. He watched as the world outside slowly came to life. People moving along the sidewalks, cars passing by, the normalcy of it almost surreal in its simplicity. He pulled out the small notebook from his bag, the pages filled with numbers and plans, with dreams that had been paused but not forgotten. He turned to a blank page, the pen feeling heavy in his hand as he wrote, the letters forming slowly, carefully, the beginning of something new, something that was his and his alone. He wrote down the plan he had once created in a hospital bed overseas, a plan for a small repair business, for a place where he could use the skills he had learned, where he could build something with his own hands, something that would not be taken away by the whims of others. He remembered the small storage unit he had rented, the boxes of tools and parts he had saved from his time before the army, the dream he had shared with Josh on quiet nights in the barracks, of a place where people could bring what was broken and leave with it fixed, of a place that would be filled with the hum of machines and the soft music of radios, the scent of solder and metal, the satisfaction of creating something whole from something shattered. The fear was still there, the uncertainty, the doubt that whispered he was not enough, that he would fail, that he would fall. But beneath it was a quiet determination, the memory of every step he had taken on that dusty road, of every morning he had woken up and kept moving, of every promise he had made to himself that he would not let the world break him completely. He paid for his coffee, stepping back into the morning air, the cold, sharp but not unbearable, the sky clear, the city waking up around him. He drove to the storage unit, unlocking the door, the scent of dust and oil meeting him as he stepped inside, the boxes stacked neatly, the tools waiting, the small workbench covered in a cloth. He set his bag down, pulling the cloth away, running his hand over the surface of the bench, the wood worn but sturdy, the place where he would start again. Tyrone took a deep breath, closing his eyes for a moment, letting the fear settle, letting the pain be what it was, a part of him, but not the whole. When he opened his eyes, he saw the future, not clear, not certain, but his to shape, his to claim, one small step at a time. He would build this place, not for them, not for the past, but for himself, for the man who had walked away from Lynen Street in the cold of night, carrying nothing but his resolve and the belief that he still had something to give to the world. And so he began, the morning light streaming through the open door, the city alive around him, the quiet hum of possibility filling the air as Tyrone Walker took the first real step toward freedom, toward a life that belonged to him, toward a future that he would create with his own hands, no longer a ghost in the home he had tried to save, but a man reclaiming the right to live on his own terms. The mornings began with the hum of the small heater rattling against the thin walls of the converted storage unit, the pale light of dawn creeping through the narrow window above the workbench. Tyrone would sit on the edge of the small cot he had set up in the corner, pulling on his clothes slowly, careful with the fit of the prosthetic against the scarred skin of his leg, each movement a reminder of the path he had walked to reach this small, cold space that smelled of oil, dust, and metal. The air was sharp when he opened the door to let in the light, but it felt clean, honest, without the suffocating weight of expectations that had clung to him in the house on Lynen Street. Each day was the same, but also different, filled with small victories and quiet defeats. He began with the basics, pulling the old radios and small appliances from the boxes he had stored for years, cleaning them with steady hands, testing wires, soldering connections, breathing life back into what others had deemed broken. The satisfaction was quiet but real, the hum of a radio crackling back to life, the warm buzz of a repaired lamp, the steady spin of a fan. It was not much, but it was his. Each piece of equipment a testament to the promise he had made to himself that he would find a way to live on his own terms. Word of his small repair business began to spread slowly, neighbors from the area venturing in with old radios that belonged to their fathers, lamps that had been gifts from grandparents, small kitchen appliances that they could not afford to replace. They came in with cautious curiosity, their eyes darting to the cot in the corner, to the small coffee pot sitting on a crate, to the medals pinned on the wall above the workbench that spoke of another life, another battle. Tyrone would greet them with a nod, his hand steady as he took the items, listening to the stories they would sometimes share, of memories tied to these small machines, of the way the world had changed around them while these pieces remained the same. He charged little, enough to cover the parts he needed, enough to buy food, to keep the small heater running, to slowly begin saving for something more. He found a rhythm in the days, the hours slipping by as he worked, the sharp smell of solder mixing with the faint scent of the instant coffee he made in the mornings. At night, he would sit on the cot, the light from the small lamp casting long shadows on the walls, the silence filled with the soft ticking of a repaired clock, the hum of a fan that now worked again, small reminders that he was capable of fixing what was broken, even if it was only in these small, tangible ways. But the nights were also long, and the darkness brought with it the memories he could not silence. The sudden bang of a car door outside would send his heart racing, his breath catching in his throat as the memories of sand and smoke, of the explosion, of Josh's lifeless eyes staring into the sky, would flash behind his eyes. He would wake in the dark, sweat cold on his skin, the phantom pain in his leg flaring so sharply that he would gasp, gripping the edge of the cot, grounding himself in the reality that he was safe, that the war was behind him, that the only enemies now were the doubts that whispered he was not enough, that he would never be enough. On the days when the pain was too much, he would limp to the door and step outside, letting the cold air clear his mind, the sky above him wide and endless, reminding him of the mornings in the desert before the heat became unbearable, before the silence was shattered by violence. He would stand there, breathing, reminding himself that he had survived, that he had come back, that he was still here, even when it felt like pieces of him had been left behind in the sand, in the screams that echoed in the darkness of his mind. It was on one of those mornings, as he was setting out the small sign he had made from a piece of old wood with the words Walker Repairs painted in careful letters, that an old man approached, carrying a heavy radio in his arms, the leather strap cracked and frayed. The man's eyes were cautious but kind, his hands shaking slightly as he placed the radio on the workbench, explaining that it had belonged to his wife, that she used to listen to the gospel station every morning before she passed, that it had stopped working years ago, but he could not bear to throw it away. Tyrone nodded, taking the radio gently, feeling the weight of the man's words as he promised to try his best to bring it back to life. He worked on it for hours, carefully cleaning the components, replacing wires, testing the circuits, his hands moving with a steadiness that came from years of practice, from the discipline the Army had drilled into him, from the quiet determination that he had found in the months since he had walked away from Lynden Street. When the radio finally crackled to life, the sound of static giving way to the soft, clear voice of a gospel singer filling the small space, Tyrone felt a warmth in his chest that no heater could provide. When the old man returned, his eyes filled with tears as he listened to the music, his hands clutching the radio to his chest, thanking Tyrone over and over, leaving a small bundle of bills on the counter despite Tyrone's protests, saying that it was worth every penny to hear her favorite songs again. After he left, the small shop felt different. The air warmer, the space filled with a quiet peace that settled around Tyrone as he sat at the workbench, looking at the tools, at the small sign in the window, at the medals on the wall, and for the first time in a long time, he felt like he was where he was meant to be. But it was not always easy. There were days when customers did not come, when the small heater failed, when the phantom pain was so sharp that he could not stand, when the memories of the desert were too loud to ignore. On those days, he would sit quietly, his hands resting on the table, reminding himself of the promise he had made, of the reasons he had chosen this path, of the freedom he had fought for, even if it had come with a cost that he would carry for the rest of his life. He found small joys in the routine, in the smell of coffee in the mornings, in the quiet hum of a working radio, in the smile of a customer who left with something fixed, something whole. He learned to cook simple meals on the small hot plate he kept in the corner, to stretch the few dollars he earned into something that could last the week, to find contentment in the simplicity of a day spent working with his hands, in the quiet pride of building something from nothing. One evening, as the sun was setting, casting long shadows through the open door of the shop, a young boy came in, holding a small fan that had stopped working. His eyes were wide, his hands clutching the fan tightly as he explained that it was for his grandmother, that she liked to sit by the window with the fan blowing while she read, that he wanted to surprise her by getting it fixed. Tyrone took the fan, smiling, telling the boy to come back the next day, and worked on it late into the night, the small blades spinning freely again, the motor humming quietly when he tested it. When the boy returned, his face lit up with a smile so bright that it chased away the shadows that had lingered in the corners of the shop. He thanked Tyrone, pressing a crumpled $5 bill into his hand, running out into the evening light, the fan clutched to his chest. Tyrone stood at the door, watching him go, the cool air brushing against his face, the sound of the city around him like a gentle reminder that life was still moving, that there was still goodness in the world, that he was a part of it. That night, as he sat on the cot, a small lamp casting its glow across the walls, Tyrone felt a quiet peace settle over him, a calm that came from knowing he was building something real, something honest, something that belonged to him alone. The road ahead was still uncertain, the challenges still many, but he was no longer running from the darkness, no longer trapped by the expectations of others, no longer a ghost in a home that had pushed him away. He was here, in this small, imperfect space, creating a life with his own hands, step by careful step, building a future that was his to claim, his to shape, a life that was hard but real, where each day was a testament to the strength he had found within himself. And as the city settled into the quiet of the night, Tyrone closed his eyes, letting the soft hum of the repaired fan, the ticking of the clock, the distant sounds of the world outside lull him into a sleep that was deep and dreamless, a sleep that was earned, a sleep that was free. The mornings began to carry a softer kind of light, the kind that eased through the dusty window above Tyrone's workbench and fell across the tools, the small containers of screws and wires lined neatly along the shelves he had built himself. The city outside was waking with the quiet promise of spring, the cold giving way to the fragile warmth that settled in the concrete, in the air that swept down the streets, in the laughter of children who passed by his small shop on their way to school. Tyrone would stand at the door with a cup of coffee in hand, leaning against the frame, the steam rising in slow curls as he watched the world move, allowing himself the smallest smile as he thought of how far he had come from that cold night when he had walked away from Linden Street with nothing but a duffel bag and the determination to reclaim himself. Inside the shop, life had taken on a rhythm that soothed the restless parts of him. The mornings were spent working through the repairs that lined up on the shelves, a radio that only played static, a lamp that flickered when turned on, a record player that had stopped spinning, each item arriving with a story, a memory attached to it that the owners would share in quiet voices as they placed their trust into Tyrone's capable hands. He listened, nodded, and took each piece, promising to bring it back to life, to preserve the memories that clung to these objects that seemed so simple, yet meant everything to the people who brought them in. The afternoons were filled with the hum of machines, the quiet crackle of a soldering iron, the soft strains of a repaired radio playing in the corner, filling the shop with music that kept the silence from becoming heavy. Customers came and went, some staying to chat, others leaving notes of thanks, small tokens of appreciation. A plate of home-cooked food, a cup of coffee from the cafe down the street, a warm handshake that lingered just long enough to remind Tyrone that he was becoming a part of the community, that his presence was valued not just for the services he provided, but for the way he listened, for the way he treated each repair as if it were his own. As the business grew, so did Tyrone's confidence in himself, in his ability to build something lasting with his own two hands, to create a life that was separate from the expectations and judgments of the family he had once nearly broken himself to save. The fear that had once clung to him like a shadow began to recede, replaced by the quiet assurance that he was capable, that he was allowed to live for himself, to find joy in the small successes that came with each repaired item, each satisfied customer, each day that ended with a sense of quiet pride. But the journey was not without its challenges. The phantom pain remained, a dull throb that would flare unexpectedly, reminding him of the cost he had paid, of the part of himself that he had left behind in the dust and smoke of a road far from home. There were nights when the memories came back, vivid and sharp, the dreams of explosions, of the faces of friends lost, of the sound of gunfire and the weight of a rifle in his hands. He would wake in the dark, sweat cold on his skin, his breath coming in harsh gasps as he sat on the edge of the cot, grounding himself with the feel of the floor beneath his feet, the quiet hum of the city outside, the knowledge that he was safe, that he was home. On those nights, he would walk to the workbench, turning on the small lamp, letting its warm light fill the room as he worked on a small repair, letting the familiar motions soothe the jagged edges of his mind, reminding himself that he was here, that he had survived, that he was building something that mattered. The work became his refuge, the steady rhythm of it a balm for the wounds that still ached, the scars that were not visible but felt deeply. It was during one of these quiet nights that the letter arrived, slipped under the door, the envelope worn creased, his name written in the familiar, careful handwriting of his sister. He sat for a long moment, the letter in his hands, the weight of it pressing into his chest as he traced the letters with his thumb before opening it, unfolding the paper slowly, bracing himself for the words that would follow. Naomi's letter was filled with updates about her life, about school, about the small moments that she wished she could share with him in person. She wrote about how much she missed him, about how different the house felt without his presence, about how she had begun to understand the sacrifices he had made for them, the weight he had carried so that she and Andre could have a chance at a better life. She apologized for the silence, for the way she had stood by while their father's words had pushed him away, for the way she had been too young to understand the pain he had been carrying. She wrote that she was proud of him, that she had seen his shop online, that she had heard from neighbors about the kindness he showed, about the way he helped people, about the way he had built something from nothing. She told him that she wanted to see him, to visit the shop, to see the life he had created, to tell him in person that she was grateful, that she loved him, that he was not alone. Tyrone sat with the letter in his hands, the words blurring as tears filled his eyes, silent tears that fell onto the paper, smudging the ink as he pressed the letter to his chest, letting the sobs shake through him in the quiet of the night, a release of the pain he had held inside for so long. He let himself grieve the loss of the family he had tried to save. Let himself mourn the boy who had left Lynen Street with the belief that he could fix everything, that love alone would be enough to hold them together. When the tears stopped, he felt lighter, the burden eased by the simple truth that he was allowed to choose who his family was, that love was not something that could be demanded or owed, but something that was given freely, chosen, built with trust and respect and understanding. Naomi was his family, Andre was his family, and the people who had come into his life, who had supported him, who had seen him for who he was and accepted him, they were his family too. Days later, Naomi arrived at the shop, her smile the same as it had been when she was a child, her eyes bright as she stepped into the small space, taking in the workbench, the tools, the repaired items lined neatly on the shelves. She hugged him tightly, holding on for a long time, and he held her back, closing his eyes as he let himself believe that he was allowed this, that he was allowed to be loved, that he was allowed to be proud of what he had built. They spent the day together, Naomi asking questions about the repairs, about the customers, about the plans he had for the future. She told him about her dreams, about her hopes, about the life she wanted to build for herself, and Tyrone listened, nodding, offering advice when she asked, his heart filled with a quiet pride as he saw the strength in her, the determination that mirrored his own. In the evenings, as the city settled into the soft hush of dusk, they would sit outside the shop, watching the lights come on in the windows of the buildings around them, the street lights casting their glow across the sidewalks, the world around them alive with the soft sounds of life continuing, moving forward, growing. Naomi would rest her head on his shoulder, and Tyrone would close his eyes, letting the peace of the moment settle into him, letting the warmth of her presence remind him that he was not alone, that he had chosen this life, that he had chosen to build something for himself, something real, something lasting. The shop became a place not just of work, but of connection, of community, of family. Neighbors would stop by to chat, to bring small gifts, to ask for advice, to share stories. Children would come to watch him work, their eyes wide with curiosity, asking questions about the tools, about how things worked, about how to fix what was broken. Tyrone would smile, taking the time to teach them, to show them, to encourage their curiosity, finding joy in their laughter, in their eagerness to learn, in the way they reminded him of the simple beauty in creating, in repairing, in building. As the days turned into weeks, and the weeks into months, Tyrone found himself looking forward to each morning, to the light that filled the shop, to the work that waited, to the people who came through the door, to the small moments of connection that filled the space with warmth. The past remained a part of him, the memories, the pain, the loss, but they no longer defined him, no longer held him captive. He had learned to live with them, to honor them, to use them as a reminder of the strength he had found within himself. And as the seasons changed, bringing the warmth of summer, the colors of autumn, the quiet of winter, and the promise of spring, Tyrone Walker stood in the doorway of his shop, looking out at the world he had claimed for himself, the world he had built with his own hands, the world that was filled with the family he had chosen, the life he had created, the freedom he had earned. In that quiet, in that peace, in the soft hum of the repaired radios, in the laughter of the children, in the smiles of his customers, in the warmth of his sister's embrace, Tyrone knew that he was home, that he was whole, that he was exactly where he was meant to be. If you found this story meaningful, subscribe for more. Check out the next video and others on the channel, and share this video with someone who needs to hear it.